If you remember the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden in May of 2011, they went to the idea that the SEAL Team 6 failed and some of them were killed, or all of them were killed. And then they worked backward and said, if this doesn't work, why?
Welcome to the Inside Forbes Council's podcast. Each episode shares transformative insights and advice from members of Forbes Councils, a group of invitation-only communities for successful executives and entrepreneurs. This is Inside Forbes Councils.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Inside Forbes Councils. I'm your host, Stephen Ganoza. Today, we welcome back one of our regular contributors, John Hittler, a transformational business coach at Evoking Genius. John's content never fails to disappoint our listeners, and today is no exception. I think we've all had the experience of planning a project, thinking that we've had all the pieces in place, and then being surprised or frustrated or angry when things don't go as planned. Now, you might think that the goal of project planning is to map out how to achieve all your objectives and avoid failure, but pre-mortem project planning does something a little bit different. Start by assuming your project will fail. Yes, it sounds a bit pessimistic, but it could be an effective way to mitigate risk and actually achieve your project's objectives. Here's John Hittler with more.
Question: are you using or conducting pre-mortems as part of your planning process? Pre-mortems? Yeah. As opposed to a post-mortem, we call it a pre-mortem. Great for planning. So let's introduce the topic real quickly and then we'll show you how to use it. A post-mortem is pretty easy. Normally you think of an autopsy and a post-mortem assigns the cause of death. Well, in your team, you do planning, and when you fail, it's the same thing. You have a post-mortem and say, gosh, why did we fail? Well, no one sets out to fail, but sometimes we do. You set forth your best plan, you go off-site and you debate about it, and you say, this is what we're going to do for the year. Then 1, 2, 3, go, everybody's on deck until it fails. Well, what if instead, after you built your plan, to the best of your ability, you went, let's say it's an annual sales plan, you fast forwarded to December 31st and took this assumption. You assume that you failed miserably, and you're looking back on the year, but you're doing this in January or February. What caused you to fail? You're doing a pre-mortem. You're assigning or speculating the causes of failure in advance so that you can actually bake the remedies for those into your redone plan. Simple enough? Well, the great thing is it's not that hard. It's brilliant, but not that hard. So here's a couple of tips to help. The easy ones you'll say, well, our best customer left, or we lost our key salesperson, or we had a recession. You'll get to those in 15 seconds. Normally, the reason we fail is the unknown or quote-unquote surprises that hit us during the year. I'll give you an example. I've started 9 companies in my career. One of them failed literally overnight. Now, we did our usual. We did our great planning. We said we're going to crush it this year. We had 26 employees. We're going to do great. Halfway through the year, 3 of our employees, high-level employees, recruited the top customers. We had two gorillas, 2 big customers who accounted for half the revenue, set up shop across the street, went into business and made a better deal with our 2 top customers. And before we knew what hit us, they were our biggest competitor and had eaten our lunch. We were done. 26 employees with half the revenue. Now we were down to 23, but our 2 best customers walked out the door. Oh, now here's the worst part. These 3 guys didn't even have the decency to send us a 90-day notice and say, hey, by the way, we're going to be incredibly unethical and illegal, break our contract, steal the bacon, walk across the street and crush you. Of course they did it in the middle of the night. That in a pre-mortem might have come out as a possibility. Now, had it come out as a possibility, probably the looks on their faces, because they didn't hatch that idea overnight. We could have had a better idea that it was coming had we sourced it in a pre-mortem. Well, where did this come from? If you remember the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden in May of 2011, late in 2010, intelligence experts from both Europe and the United States were onto the fact that there was a courier making deliveries quite frequently to a compound in a small village in Pakistan. Now, a military style, like bomb shelter, like a big high walls and fortress, and no one knew who lived inside. As they continued to watch the house for 6 to 8 months, confidence grew that whoever this important person was could actually be Osama bin Laden. Problem is they couldn't prove it, because since no one ever came outside of the compound, they burned their own trash, they lived self-sufficiently, very high security to get in and out of the compound. They couldn't prove it. They wanted proof before they sent military in to take him out. Well, they weren't going to get actual or 100% proof. So what they had to do was come up with a bunch of options, possibilities, including crazy ones like, why don't we throw a smoke bomb down the chimney, flush everybody out of the house, and if bin Laden pops out, we'll shoot him. Crazy, but you know what? Sometimes you need the crazy ones to actually boil it down to the best two options. Here's what they came up with. One was to bomb the place to smithereens, and here's why. They would make sure that no one inside the house was able to leave alive. You wouldn't lose any military lives because you would bomb it from way above, or in these days you'd probably use a drone, but they were going to use bombers and just blow the place to smithereens. The problem with that, though, the hair in the ointment on that one, was that you wouldn't be able to prove that you got bin Laden, because probably there would be no DNA left. The second option, the second candidate that made it through, there were 37 options that they considered, and the top two were blow the place to smithereens, and the other was the eventual option, which was send in the Navy SEAL Team 6. Here's the problem with the SEAL Team 6. Now, this is where they invented this concept of a pre-mortem. They went to the idea that the SEAL Team 6 failed and some of them were killed, or all of them were killed. And then they worked backward and said, if this doesn't work, why? What would possibly go wrong? Well, they went through all the possible different scenarios for 6 months and then trained. And in the end, even with difficulties, remember the Black Hawk helicopter crashed right at the beginning. They started off poorly. They met essentially no resistance, shot him and brought him out, and they were able to prove that it was him. And that was the big thing. And here's why. They needed proof, because if you remember, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq got George W. Bush in big trouble. Big to-do, lots of lives at stake, lots of military dollars, and they never found any weapons of mass destruction. Embarrassing, and it really hurt him politically. Before that, Jimmy Carter, if you remember at the end of his failed first presidency, I mean, he had one term and was out, he tried to save or rescue the 444 Iraqi hostages, or Iranian hostages, and they didn't do very well. And of course, that was the final nail in his coffin. He went one term and he was out. Obama was in his first term in May of 2011, about 18 months from the re-election. The last thing he needed was a mess on his hand because they didn't plan for any contingency. He needed this to be a success. And the last thing they wanted was the loss of military life. The second best option was maybe they lost a Navy SEAL, but they got bin Laden. But in the end, they got him with no loss of life. Woohoo! Good thing. So, I'm going to switch back to your team. When you use this process, here's the simplest way to do it. Develop your plan, your aspirational plan, your positive plan. We're going to grow sales by this much. We're going to have our best year ever. All that rah-rah stuff. Then ask, looking back on the year, assuming that you failed, why? Why did we fail? And come up with as many oddball and reasonable scenarios why you failed in less than 5 minutes. Why less than 5 minutes? If you have to justify it and tell the whole story, it gets bogged down. So you say, we hit a recession. Unexpected that the recession was so deep. Our top sales guy, our VP of sales left. Yep. We lost a big client. Yep. All those things are reasonable. And then you get to the unreasonable one. And I'll give you an example of an unreasonable one. I just worked with a client who decided he's 64, he just retired, and what he's going to do in his retirement is go from a 14 handicap golfer to a scratch golfer. And he'd like to do it in a year. He'd like to get serious about golf, take lessons, practice, and essentially make it a career. Admirable. Good for him. For context, a 14 handicap is kind of a duffer, kind of a mediocre, medium. They enjoy the game, they can play, but they're not great. A scratch golfer or a par golfer is somebody that shoots par. So he wants to go from a 14 handicap to a 0 handicap. When we did this exercise with him, he came up with all the reasonable scenarios where he might fail. The one that had him shift his focus was socially based. Normally, duffers or mediocre golfers play with other mediocre golfers. They're all about the same. They play together, they enjoy each other's company, and you do this over long periods of time. And he had said, yeah, my long-standing group is 20 years in the making. Problem is, if that's the case, the scratch golfers or the par golfers also do the same. He would face the indelicate scenario that he would have to leave his 20-year comrades or colleagues in order to go and play with people that fit his new skill level. So the question we ask him is, 2, are you ready to leave your buddies? And 2, will the new group accept you into their level of golf? Because golf is a very social game. And he had never thought about that. And he said, I'm not willing to leave my buddies. So he readjusted his plans. He still wants to make golf the cornerstone of his retirement, but he readjusted it by doing a pre-mortem. Very, very smart idea from him. You can do this in your team as well. It's simple, it's easy, it's intuitive. And I would say you will fail less and succeed more by conducting a pre-mortem as an effective part of your planning.
Thanks, John, for another excellent insight. By assuming our projects will fail, we are forced to anticipate all the reasons for that inevitable failure, and by doing so, might just avoid that failure altogether. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
This has been Inside Forbes Councils. Please be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a member of the Forbes Councils and would like to participate in our podcast series, please email your member concierge. If you're interested in joining a Forbes Council, learn more at ForbesCouncils.com.